Good evening and welcome to the Bethany Baptist Church Midweek Connection Point. It is Wednesday, April 28, 2021. Thank you for joining us. I'm glad that we've still got several followers who are not in our town or not able to come on Wednesday nights but are following along in our video devotions and also hearing updates about things in our church. So thank you for joining. I'm encouraged by you, and I want to encourage you from God's Word. We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 29. We're getting close into the book. I'm ready to be done. I've got 3 more chapters, including tonight's chapter. So 1 Samuel chapter 29. As you're turning there, I want to encourage you. We've had good evangelism encounters from different people in our church, talking to our neighbors, talking to friends at the park, talking to co-workers. I'm proud of Zach Gibbs, hearing about him trying to witness to strangers, telling them about his faith, and even my own wife, who's been faithful to invite folks to church. And we saw the blessed fruit of that last Sunday. We had 9 different guests, a large family, and another friend that came to our church Sunday to hear the gospel, to see our church community, and hopefully be encouraged to join and participate. Continue praying for one another, for health needs in our church, for unity, for the gospel to bear fruit in the lives of all those that we're witnessing to. So 1 Samuel chapter 29 is only 11 verses this evening. I want to read it to you now. Verse 1 says this: Now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. As the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish, the commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now 4 days and years? And since he deserted me, I have found no fault in him to this day." But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is not this David, of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Verse 6, Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign, for I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you. So go back now and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." And David said to Achish, "But what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered David and said, "I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, 'He shall not go up with us to the battle.' Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning, and depart as soon as you have light." So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, but the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Very interesting chapter, one you've probably never read before, and at first glance doesn't seem to be very profitable. And so I even meditated on 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, I think, that all Scripture is God-breathed, and all Scripture is profitable, not only for teaching, to tell us what God had done, but for reproof, for rebuke, for exhortation, that the man and the woman of God may be trained in every good work to follow the Lord. So this is part of all of Scripture. It's going to be profitable for us tonight. So let's pick up in verse 1. This is going to help us recap what's been going on, get the big picture of the chapter, of the whole book of 1 and 2 Samuel, and God's plan of redemption, his plan in all of history. It says in verse 1, "The Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel." So we have a big battle about to happen. The Israelites are drawing up the line against the Philistines. The Philistines have a whole lot, and this battle is about to happen. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose, somebody's going to die, and somebody's going to survive. But this is more than just any other random battle. This is a battle between the people that God has called his own and an enemy nation. This is similar to the battle of David and Goliath, when David was representing the Israelites and Goliath, the Philistines. The beginning of the book of 1 Samuel opens with the Philistines triumphing in victory over the wicked Israelites. And here they are coming to battle at the end of the book in a big, big battle. Now, we already know through 1 Samuel chapter 28 what God is going to do in this battle. Do you remember? Who's going to win? Who's going to die? Whose side is God going to fight to help? This is very interesting. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 28. God rebukes Saul, the king of Israel, through the prophecy of Samuel as he's called up by the medium. Okay, in verse 18 of chapter 28, he says this, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. So it's important that we know the context. We know what David does not know. We know what the Philistines do not know. And that is this, is that God is about to side with the Philistines in disciplining and destroying some of his own people. Yes, God would do this. God has done this again and again throughout history and through the stories of the Old Testament. God is going to punish Israel because of Saul's wickedness, of disobeying his commands, of blaspheming his name, and just misrepresenting him. God is going to side with the Philistines and kill Saul. So there's something bigger going on than just another random battle. We know the outcome. We know that God is going to prove a point, that God is going to uphold his name as holy. And surprisingly, it's going to happen by letting Saul and the Israelites lose, which is why we need to know this context, because David is in a weird position. David is God's anointed one. David is a man after God's own heart, and David is not fighting with the Israelites right now. He's with the Philistines. So David has put himself in a weird predicament, an unadvised one. He shouldn't be fighting with the Philistines. And God is going to, in his providence, rescue him from culpability of fighting with the Philistines against Israel, and rescue him of culpability of fighting with Israel against the Philistines, if he would change his mind in the middle of battle. So bear with me. It's important that we understand this as we go on. So first I want you to see in verses 2 through 5 that God did not want David to remain with the Philistines and turn and fight against Israel. Here's why. David's been running and hiding for about 2 years with the Philistines, God's enemy nation, from the book of 1 Samuel, and been helping them win battles. But God helps the Philistines to discover that David is there to rescue him from fighting with them. Verse 2, as the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and thousands, David and his men were passing on the rear with Achish. And the commander of the Philistines said, what are these Hebrews doing here? So for 2 years, David has gone undetected fighting with the Philistines, and now the Philistines catch him and notice him. We have to believe that for 2 years, God did not allow him to be caught, but now David has allowed him to be caught. I think it's because the battle that's about to happen is one that David cannot participate in. David doesn't understand that. The Philistines don't necessarily understand that, but God does. And so he allows him to be caught and to be discovered. If you were David, you might be frustrated here, and you might want to be angry at God, but could you trust God's providence and even allowing yourself to be caught? That God has a bigger plan here. Could David trust him? Now, the Philistines, so there's 4 kings. They go to the 5th king, the king of Achish, because there's 5 provinces in Philistia. They go to him and they say, what is David doing fighting on our side? He's our enemy. How is he here? Achish says in verse 3 to the commanders of the Philistines, this is David. He's the servant of Saul the king. He has been with me now for days and years, and since he deserted me, I've found no fault in him to this day. So he says, hey, we can trust him. He's been good. He's helped us. He'll stay on our side. So he tries to persuade the Philistines to let David fight, and the Philistines will not have it. If you're David, could you trust this, that even though you know that you're in the right, that people wouldn't believe you, that they would turn against him here? David's going to have to trust him. He doesn't understand what's going on here. In the end, he's going to end up trusting him. So the rest of the kings, they cannot be persuaded to let David continue fighting. Verse 4, but the commanders of the Philistines, the rest of them, they were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, send the man back that he return to the place which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. So they're right. David could turn and start fighting against them, and they could lose the battle that they want to win selfishly and rightly on their part. So God allows David to be discovered. God allows David and his supporter not to be persuasive to the rest of the kings. And God also has allowed these kings to know the full potential of David if he were to turn and to fight against the Philistines with the Israelites. Pick up in verse 4 again. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to the Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is not this David of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000. So not only has God allowed the Philistines, these four kings, to know that David's here and to not be persuaded to let him fight, but they've heard about what's going on in the other kingdom. They've heard this song that David, when he fights, he wins because God is on his side. He is stronger than even the king Saul who's over there. He kills by the thousands. So they've heard this rumor. And it says that they've heard about this breach between David and Saul. That's interesting that the breach between two Israelites has made it all the way to the Philistines. It's come to their attention and they know. So in their own battle wisdom and tactic, they're like, no. We're not going to let David fight with us because we could get out in the middle of battle and he might come to a weak moment, or maybe he's playing this and he's going to say, no, I'm going to turn and fight against the Philistines and help the Israelites win, because this will be a way to make Saul like me. This will be a way to kill the Philistines. And so these four kings of Philistines are like, no, we're not going to let that happen. And they're right. David could do that. David might do that. It's hard to tell if David was planning on helping Israel at the last moment fight against the Philistines, or if he's going to be faithful to keep fighting with the Philistines and destroy the Israelites. But remember, back up for a second. There's something bigger going on here than just David in a regular battle. God has said he's going to kill many of the Israelites and Saul and his sons by the hand of the Philistines. So David can't fight for Israel against the Philistines, or it would disrupt God's plan. And so God in his providence is keeping David from being in a place where he could turn and fight against the Philistines and allow Saul to survive. David doesn't get this. But God is sovereign over all these things. God is sovereign to rescue David out of a place he does not understand the potential for harm beyond his limited perspective and understanding. Okay, so the second half, that was the first. God does not want David to turn and to fight with the Israelites against the Philistines. The second is this. I get this from verses 6 through 10. God does not want to let and will not let David stay and fight with the Philistines against the Israelites. Are you tracking with me? I hope this makes sense. This is very important as we understand the providence of God and his greater plan in doing things with David for his great name and disciplining and judging Saul. All right, so I get this from verses 6 through 10. Again, God does not want to let David, will not let David fight with the Philistines. So verse 6, Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives, you have been honest to me, and it seems right that you should march out in and with me in the campaign. For I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the Lords do not approve of you. So Achish says, hey, I went to bat for you. I know you've been faithful for many years with me. You have been blameless. But and I know you will help me, but my superiors, my advisors said, I cannot let you fight with me. Here I want you to see that Achish has discovered David's power and David's God. Did you notice this? Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives. Achish has been persuaded by David's faithfulness, honest, blameless behavior for these years of living among him to invoke his Lord. It could be this is a sign that he's believing or he's saved, so to speak, or just that he's willing to trust that David's a good person. Now, there's something here for us to learn. David lived in such a way among the pagans, among the Philistines, that they saw him as blameless. Later he's going to say, like an angel of God. Could it be said of us that even when we're among the lost, or especially when they're lost, that they might not want us to be on their side, but they have nothing that they can say against us? We're not stealing like others at work. We're not being lazy like others at work, but that we've been blameless. So they could say, I'm tempted to believe in this Christian's God because of the way they carry themselves and the way they prove themselves among us for years in a secular school, a secular university, a secular job force, among lost friends. Achish has discovered David's God. But yet, David's going to plead with him and say, so see, can't you let me stay and fight with you, the Philistines, against the Israelites? Let me stay. And Achish will not be persuaded. Verse 8, David said to Achish, but what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Achish answered David and said to him, I know that you are blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he shall not go with us to the battle. Now, this is a very similar parallel. I want you to see the structure of our text unfold. I showed you the two halves, but here you have a parallel from the first half in particular. Do you remember when the Philistines, the four leaders, said, what is David doing here? Achish came to bat for him and said, no, let him stay. And they said, no, we're not going to be persuaded. Now you have Achish going to David and saying, you can't stay with me. David comes, no, please let me stay. And Achish is not persuaded. Twice you have two different people reasoning for David staying, and in God's providence, these rulers cannot be persuaded differently. They cannot be persuaded. This is a turn of the hand of God, who turns kings whichever way his heart desires. God moves among them, and David needs to trust this. We're going to see David's going to trust this, but Achish cannot be persuaded. He says, I know you're a good person, but I'm going with my superiors. You need to trust me. You're not allowed to fight with us against Israel. Are you following with me? There's big things going on here, but God turns the king's hearts, both sections, the first half and the second half of our text, for God's greater purpose, a greater purpose that David doesn't even understand. How do I know that David understands it? Because David's not so quick to give in. He's like, no, but let me stay. I want to help fight. David doesn't get what's going on here. David is maybe having a lapse of judgment, or David, just frankly, he doesn't know that God has said, I'm going to kill Saul in this battle tomorrow. David doesn't know all the prophecies, but God is keeping his word. God is controlling things beyond what David, or what you and I, understand. And the last part of this, to show that God does not want David to fight with the Philistines. Verse 10, God is going to change David's heart so that he is sent away. Verse 10, now then rise early, this is what the king tells him, in the morning, with the servants of your Lord who came with you, start early in the morning and depart as soon as you have light. So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, but the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Achish says, you can't stay with me. You've got to go. And finally, David, maybe out of submission, out of a way to continue that God would have a good name, to act blameless as he has, he says, okay, I won't fight. I'll pick up my men and we will retract from the battlefield, lest we be with the Israelites or with the Philistines. So this is where we come full circle. And it is what I've been trying to say from the beginning, that God is doing something that David does not understand, but God is going to preserve David from sinning. Preserve David from sinning. David has brought himself into this unadvised position where he's kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, that he might go to battle and accidentally help the Israelites up in God's plan of defeating the Philistines, or in this rock and a hard place that he might stay with the Philistines and help the Philistines by his own hand kill Saul. God is protecting him from sins he does not understand. God is sovereign for his namesake. Now, why did I say that was a sin? Why would it be a sin if God had said, I'm going to use the Philistines to kill Saul? Why would it be a sin for David to be a part of that? Well, a couple of reasons here. First is that if David helps the Philistines kill some of the Israelites, would David later be able to go and convince the Israelites that he was their king, and rightfully so after Saul is killed, to follow him? Would they be able to trust him? No. They would say, you actually worked against us. You helped the enemy. We can't trust you. We can't follow you. That would be a dangerous place to allow David to be in. God is protecting him from that. But I think chiefly he's protecting them of this. Have you noticed one of the temptations of David all throughout the book of Samuel has been to retaliate against his enemy Saul, to take vengeance in his own hands. And time after time, David has been convicted. God has protected him from returning the evil of Saul to David back upon him, killing his brother enemy. God is protecting David from being put in a place to do this. Yes, a weak moment, a moment to turn into the flesh and to kill Saul and undo everything God's been trying to teach David, everything that God's been trying to teach us about how we deal with our enemies, everything that God has been trying to do in the book of 1 Samuel. God is protecting him. And so the only way for God to do this is to remove him completely from the battle. In fact, we're going to see in the next chapter, 100 miles away from the battle, lest he help the Philistines defeat Saul, or he turn and help the Israelites with Saul defeat the Philistines. God is protecting his anointed from this sin. And so I want to end with this text that's been in my mind all day. This is Psalm chapter 19, verse 12 through 13. Why don't you turn there with me, and I will show you God's providence and his wisdom for his saints and for sanctifying his name as holy among the nations. Psalm 19. This is the one that has helped me interpret the text the last week or so. Psalm chapter 19, verse 12 through 13. It reads this way. It says this: "Who can discern his errors? Declare me innocent from hidden faults. Keep back your servant also from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me. Then I shall be blameless and innocent of great transgression." So the man of God, and that's actually a prayer of David, the one who's been transformed by God's grace, they don't want to sin. They don't even want to commit sins that they're not even aware of that they might commit. And so they entrust themselves to God. God, rearrange my plans, intervene providentially to keep me from sinning, whatever it takes. If that means me being found out, if that means me being falsely accused, if that means I have to submit to ungodly authorities and their counsel, keep me from sin. See, David didn't understand what was going on. But later I think he looks back and he says, God, you were good. You kept me from falling in a dangerous spot, a rock in a hard place, taking matters in my own hands, or upending your will and changing the outcome of this battle. So can you pray that way? Two things. One, can you pursue blamelessness as David did among a crooked and perverse generation, so they have no reason to blaspheme God, no reason to accuse you? And two, can you trust God that he is good in ways we don't understand and keeping us from sins we don't even know we were going to commit, and things that are beyond and above us in the battlefields of life? Can you trust him, and will you walk in a blameless way? He is a good God, and he is about his glory. If we trust him, we get to be a part of that by his mercy. Hope you understood that chapter. Hope you were encouraged. Hope you will do those two things as you see God's plan of redemption unfold. Love you. Have a good night.